Hey baby, you look sharp through this lens. If you want your girl to look like a 10, just buy this lens and look through it. This lens will make people go from a 2 to a 9. Okay, but in all seriousness, this is a great lens and I'm going to tell you why today. We are talking about the Sigma 35 f1.4 art lens for Sony E mount specifically. Let's get the blaring question out of your mind first. What price is this lens? Well, depending on where and when you buy it, it ranges from about $700 to $750, which is a pretty dang good price for a Sigma art lens. As I said, this lens is 35mm. It is a full frame lens, so that's pretty wide. Of course, if you put it on a crop sensor, then it will crop it. This lens has an f1.4 aperture, so even though you have that wide focal length, you're going to get a pretty nice amount of depth of field. And it uses a mechanical focusing system, but a little bit more on that later. Unfortunately, this does not have optical image stabilization. However, at a price of just $750 for everything else that you get, I'm not too worried about that. Especially if the camera that you have for it has in-body image stabilization like my Sony A7R III does. Of course, all of these specifications and features sound great, but how does it hold up in a real-life scenario? Well, I've been using this lens for about the past month and a half, and I've used it for several use cases in video and photo both. In fact, right now I'm filming on this lens at f2.8, and it holds up really well. This lens is sharp. The depth of field is great as you would expect, and the build quality is pretty good. Again, a little bit more on that later. Let's dive even deeper into the image quality. As I said, it is sharp and will easily keep up with resolution such as 43 megapixels like my Sony A7R III has, and I imagine that it would even keep up with the Sony A7R IV's resolution, which is much higher. And not only is it sharp in the middle, but even in the corners, this thing is surprisingly sharp. Even in a relatively low resolution, such as 4K, if I focus the camera on the background currently, then you can see that when I zoom in, a lot of this stuff is still pretty dang sharp. And when comparing this to the roughly $600 lens that I reviewed a few weeks ago, the Samyang 85mm f1.4, I gotta say, I think that this Sigma is a good bit sharper. Now, I'm not one to be too concerned about the quality of bokeh in a lens. However, I gotta say that I am pretty pleased with the bokeh of this lens, especially since it gets that nice shallow depth of field at f1.4. From my experience, the bokeh is nice and round and creamy, even at apertures of something like f2.8, which will get you a bit more of a sharper image. There isn't anything incredibly abnormal about the colors or flares in this lens. However, I have found it to be pretty resilient to flares as opposed to some other lenses that I have tested, and it handles chromatic aberration very well. I have yet to find any chromatic aberration in images unless I'm specifically looking for it. And again, there's nothing super special about the colors. They are nice and pleasing, just like many other lenses that you will test. I said that I would talk about build quality, so let me talk about build quality. This lens is surprisingly heavy for its size. It is relatively narrow, but pretty long, and does not feel uncomfortably heavy, but rather nice and robust. The casing on this lens is metal. I am not 100% sure about what type of metal, but I would guess aluminum or some type of magnesium alloy. And there's nice rubber knurling around the focus ring. The lens does come with a plastic hood. However, I do not think that this plastic feels at all cheap. There are a few other places on this lens where it uses plastic, such as the clear cover over the mechanical focusing system and the mount for the lens hood, but the rest of it, even the switches, are metal, which is very nice. The lens uses a 67mm cap thread size, which is about an average size. The mount is also metal, but unfortunately there is no weather sealing on this lens. So overall, I am very, very pleased with the build quality. The only place where I think it is lacking is the lack of weather sealing. But at a lens of this great price and image quality, you can't expect too much. Using this lens is very nice. As I said, it feels nice and robust, whether you're holding just the lens by itself or if it's on the camera, and it does not feel, in my opinion, too heavy. Focus ring is pretty average, nice and smooth, but it is not a linear focusing type, so you will not be able to do repeatable focus pulls in many cases. It is easier than focus by wire type focus systems though, because you have that mechanical focus indicator that you can look at. And speaking of autofocus, this lens is pretty good. Nothing super abnormal, and if you put it on a camera with a good autofocus system like my Sony A7R III, then you should get the expected results. In photo, this lens performs very well, just as fast as my Samyang or any other lens that I've tested on this camera. As you would expect, it finds eyes and faces fine, and despite the mechanical focusing type, which can be known to be slightly slower than focus by wire in some cases, it will focus on those eyes, faces, or whatever you have the box set to nice and quickly. In video, I see similar results. However, I have seen some issues with this lens and another lens that may just be an issue in my camera, where occasionally in video, in certain conditions, it will try to hunt for focus even though it's clear where it should focus. In my opinion, the biggest competitor to this lens is from Sony themselves. That is the Sony 35mm f1.8 lens, which is cheaper. Well, this is embarrassing. You're probably thinking to yourself right now, how is this Sony lens cheaper when it is $753 and the Sigma is $50 less than that? As it turns out, when I quickly looked up this lens that I was talking about, I looked up the wrong version. As it turns out, there are two of them. One of them is cheaper at about $470, which is what I thought was the more expensive one at $750. The difference is that the cheaper one has OSS, but much worse image quality, and the more expensive one has great image quality, slightly worse than the Sigma, but also no OSS, and you're paying more for the focus motor and everything that Sony puts in their lenses, slightly better build quality, and, you know, the Sony Premium. So that's that. But in the rest of the video, as I explain this other lens, I'm kind of talking about the cheap one and the expensive one at the same time. It's confusing, but hopefully my explanation just now mostly explained it for you guys. Focuses faster and has optical image stabilization. However, it is not as sharp and does not have overall as good image quality, and it is also only f1.8, which may be fine for many people, but I prefer the shallower depth of field. That lens is priced around $450 to $500 depending on where and when you buy it, and from what I know is not a bad lens and a very good option, but the wide aperture and better image quality was more appealing to me, and I was willing to spend the extra premium for those while sacrificing OSS. Overall, I think the value of this lens is very good. As I said, you get great image quality, you get pretty dang fast focusing, and you get a nice shallow depth of field, all for only around $700 to $750. Despite the lack of weather sealing and optical image stabilization, I think very much that this lens is worth the price. However, if you don't care quite as much about image quality, the Sony alternative may be a better option for you, especially if you are on a tighter budget. So overall, this lens is great. I do not regret my purchase in the least, and think that it is a very good option for anyone looking for a wide-angle lens for photo or video. Please subscribe and comment down below. What do you use this lens most for, or what do you plan to use it for? I would love to hear your thoughts. And if you want to keep watching our videos, click right here on another lens review that I did, the Samyang 85 f1.4. Let's get the blaring question out of the and I imagine that it would even there is nothing